It's an auspicious occasion. Maybe we should have waited one more year, but next year will be the 50th anniversary of the founding of American Haiku in 1963. It was the first publication devoted solely to haiku and the related senryu written in the English language, as Gayle said earlier. Besides publishing original English language haiku, it provided a forum for the discussion of both techniques and the directions that Western haiku might take. In this regard, it's kind of interesting, the appearance of American haiku sort of justified the speculations of Harold G. Henderson about whether writing haiku in English was possible, was feasible. He gave a lot of thought to this, and in fact, he wrote a letter that was published in the first issue of American Haiku, essentially thanking the editors for making his prediction or his speculations come true. American Haiku was published twice yearly for 6 years until 1968. All in all, it published 2,071 haiku.
Really?
Volume 1 was edited by James Bull and Don Eulert. Over the rest of the issues, there were a number of editors and sub-editors and poetry editors. Now, my training is originally as a criminologist, where we look very carefully at photographs to see who is there and who isn't there. And I have to wonder, why was there all of these changes here? Why did this guy suddenly disappear? Why did this guy suddenly appear? So maybe Don and Gayle will be able to fill in some of these questions that criminological scholars have been wondering about for years. Some of the best original haiku that were ever published were published in American Haiku. I have here a selection, if you want me to read them I can, of about 10 haiku from just the first issue that are absolute classics now and that probably everybody knows by heart. Shall I read those? Or
Yeah, sure.
Okay. James W. Hackett, Bitter Morning, Sparrows Sitting Without Necks. Another one by Hackett. These are from the very first issue. The fleeing sandpipers turn about suddenly and chase back the sea. O Mabsam Southard, also from the first issue. In the garden pool, dark and still, a stepping stone releases the moon. From Nick Virgilio in the second issue, Lily, out of the water, out of itself. From the same issue by the same poet, Bass, picking bugs off the moon. Clement Hoyt, a Halloween mask floating face up in the ditch, slowly shakes its head. Robert Speece from the second issue, O marvelous crow, electing to light upon the lake's level snow. Virginia Brady Young from the second issue, in a dry season she moved away, leaving her parched ailanthus tree. Elizabeth Searle Lamb from the second issue, for whose wake do the steel girders keen above the Chesapeake. Over the years, the editors of American Haiku are almost like a who's who. Don Eulert, Clement Hoyt, Robert Speece was involved from the third issue on. Phil Adams and Walter Kerr, Gustav Kaiser and Ted Larry Pebworth. All of these people wrote articles or edited poetry for the journal over the years. Sam Bryan, Joyce W. Webb, Charles Rogers, Gary Brower. Gary Brower was interesting to me because he wrote his doctor's dissertation at the University of Missouri on Latin American haiku, Mexican haiku. He now lives about 30 miles away from me, and I just hooked up with him last year. And we talk haiku, and he's published some of my longer poems as well. Everybody else here knows more than I do about this, but what happened after American Haiku? It seems, if you look at the journal itself, the last issue, it seems to have been rather precipitous. There's no notification that there wouldn't be another issue. It just simply didn't appear. So again, my criminological self wonders what happened there. But after American Haiku, Jim Bull returned to teaching English at University of Wisconsin-Platteville, retired in 1993, and he and Gayle pursued their interest in print Americana and ephemera. They published Paper Mountain Books and bought the Foundry in 2004, and Jim died the year after that. Don moved to San Diego and practiced and taught psychology between writing haiku and putting out 2 books of his haiku. Clement Hoyt remained in Houston and fought the cancer that took his life 7 years after American Haiku closed its doors. Bob Speece, of course, kept his oar very much in haiku publishing. His haiku and reviews appeared in the first issue of K. Titus Mormino's new journal called Modern Haiku in 1969. He joined the staff the next year and took over as editor in 1978 and edited for almost 30 years. Gustav Kaiser was also, like Speece, an associate editor of Modern Haiku. He died in 1978. Joyce Webb was a prominent poet in Madison. I don't know what became of her. Is she still
I think
around?
she passed away, but I'm not 100% on that.
Yeah. I've always considered that American Haiku was the direct ancestor of modern haiku, largely because of Speece's involvement. The standards that the editors set in the 1960s are the bar that we at Modern Haiku are still aiming at.
The memories I have were of Jim and Don starting the magazine. I did a lot of the grunt work, like go to the post office and pick up the stuff and the book work and that kind of thing. I knew nothing about haiku at the beginning. Jim picked up on haiku when he was medevaced out of Korea and was in the hospital in Yokohama for 8 weeks. And a Japanese ward boy kept bringing him tanka and haiku to read and introduced him to Japanese culture, which he knew something about, but not much. And then he came back and, of course, was doing graduate work. Actually, he came back and started the undergraduate work. He'd only done 2 years and went on through school. And then when he met Don, and Jim and Don were not your classical university professors at the time. I remember them both saying, they thought they got, and they didn't get any help from the university or any support from the university at all. And they both said, we are going to succeed in spite of them. And you did.
It's always been that way.
It's always been that way. And
but
then,
I didn't know about that background.
You forgot it then?
No,
Oh,
that he had learned about haiku in a hospital in Japan.
Yeah, that's where he learned about
fascinating.
it.
Do you remember the first time you were acquainted with haiku?
It would have been from Jim. Yeah.
Yes.
Probably one of our late night
One of the late nights.
wine drinking episodes.
There's always been wine drinking with haiku, so.
I've seen a little bit of the process of American Haiku from the other side. I'm working in the papers of Elizabeth Lamb, and I've seen some of the correspondence. She would send in her submissions. And you had a curious way of doing things. It seems curious to me. You had a maybe pile. She would send something in,
Yeah.
and you would send back, maybe we're going to put this on a holding list, and then some months later, as much as 6 months later, you would advise her, yes, it's been accepted, yes, it hasn't.
Yeah,
I
everything.
don't think anybody does that now. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Don't remember.
No?
Everything was gone through, and a lot of it was just
Yeah.
flat out rejected immediately.
Yeah.
Nick Virgilio was a good example of that, because Nick sent reams of haiku. He was
Yeah.
just learning as everybody was. And Jim and Don and later Bob, and I went through a lot of them too. And if they had potential, we kept them. If not, we rejected them immediately. We didn't wait until the deadline. And so we had this pile of potentials growing, and then looked at them and decided which ones we wanted to publish.
I do remember some of that. There's we really like to get a quick turnaround of people that didn't cut it at all. I remember that when I came from the University of Kansas to Platteville to teach, Jim was already there, and it was the early 60s. I had been publishing a little magazine called The Western Poet, And it was it was the kind of its mission was the kind of open spaceness and exploratory breadth, which is quite opposite from what we finally ended up doing in American Haiku. So Zen was just getting started at the time, and I learned about Zen not from Alan Watts. I learned about it from Jim Bull, and I had been interested in American transcendentalism, and I recognized what was going on with nature mysticism. Was very, very close to the spirit of Zen, and I really resonated with what Jim was talking about. We had some excited conversations about Zen attitude, and I have the bias a little bit that really good haiku arises from a Zen experience, whether it's a particular practice or not. Somewhere along the way, I have a kind of an academic exploration of Ralph Waldo Emerson as being the first natural haiku poet in America, and following the link of that. So that kind of connection excited me. Searching on the wind, the hawk's cry is the shape of its beak. And isn't that true? So like the synesthesia of the senses, the hawk's cry is the shape of its beak. Ah, like that. Get it?
I have the one that won the JL was A Bitter Morning. Sparrows sitting together without any necks, so it had to be 575. However, that same poem had been printed in the first edition of American Haiku, and it was written as he read this morning. Bitter morning, sparrows sitting without necks, which I think is a much more vivid and much more beautiful poem. Now, do you remember how you decided to get these poems and how to get out there? How did you decide that this should be a magazine, and how were you going to get writers for it?
Let me say one more thing. We about the background. I think we were sort of discipled ourselves to Harold Henderson. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the syllable count that we were just talking about, I remember Harold Henderson saying that 575 is a fetish, this syllable count business. And I think that what you just read is a good example of how much more powerful the poem is. If you it's like a little brush painting, a little here, here, and here, and just as few words as possible. I don't know if it was him or whether we had come up with this ourselves, but we were talking from him that the words should be so transparent and thin that they don't get in the way between the reader and the experience. If that's possible. So it's kind of like the haiku, the brush painting. It's like a little brush painting. You don't pay attention to the words and their cleverness. What you're after is the direct experience. So those were some of the things that we talked about in terms of theory and content. I guess we just got excited and thought, because Henderson was saying, why don't we have an American haiku? And so, well, we could do that. So we corresponded with some of the people and asked them if they would contribute. And how we opened it up to the public, I don't know. But I do know that for the first issue, if I have this right, I think we got 10,000 submissions. Is that about right?
It was a huge amount. And
Really?
You sent brochures to every creative writing teacher on campuses, and then you guys got the idea, hey, why think small? We'll advertise in the Saturday Review. So they took out an ad in the Saturday Review, and John Ciardi picked up on the ad and put in his poetry column that American Haiku, a new magazine, American Haiku was going to be published in of all the godforsaken places in the world, Platteville, Wisconsin. When Charity came as a guest lecturer, you were still there, I think, when
Yeah.
Charity came as a guest lecturer on the campus, and he actually grew to like Platteville.
Here's another little thing that that we had our issue pretty much finished, and writers are listed in the table of contents. They're listed alphabetically. And about the time we were going to press, some of them dropped out, and some of them, I think Jim was a really perfectionist. He might have asked them to make some wording changes, and they refused to do it. As I recall.
He was an ardent perfectionist.
Oh yeah, and so we had some blanks in there, and so according to where the blanks fell, if it was an R, I remember Keith Spellum wrote a couple of haiku under the pseudonym of Keith Rotewell. This is what I want to know, the sequence, because I know that after Jim had the magazine for a while, he was corresponding with Clement Hoyt, and he was kind of a benefactor, and then he bought the magazine, and then what happened?
Clem ran it for a year. He became a very good friend. He came to Wisconsin twice a year to see Dr. Mose at University Hospital, who was an expert on skin cancer, and Clem had serious skin cancers. And he became a very good friend. And he and Jim talked on the phone 2 or 3 times a month about haiku. Clem was one of the few people who called at a reasonable hour. Southern always called at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning and things like that. But and Jim and Clem talked about haiku a lot. They had a lot of disagreements about haiku. They had a lot of agreements. And sometimes I'd go to bed and they were still arguing. But
Clement Hoyt there's wonderful stories about him because he was, tell a little bit about his personality.
well, Clem was in Japan for a long time, studied Zen in Japan. He was very one-wayish. Clem ran 4 weekly newspapers in Houston, and a lot of threats on his life and that kind of thing as a result of things he was saying in the newspapers. As a matter of fact, the first time he came to visit us, Kelly and Charlie went into the room as he was unpacking, and they had absolutely never seen anybody carry a gun before. And when Clem opened the suitcase, and on the top was a gun, their eyeballs went out on stems, and they've never forgotten that.
Clement Hoyt also was the one who decided that that 575 should be a rule in haiku, and after that, I personally felt that the quality of the magazine teetered a bit because there were a lot of the poems were forced into a 575 mode.
He was a big believer in that. Jim kind of thought that you needed to learn the form and then do the variations. And so Clem kind of talked him into maybe tightening up a little bit. I still think number 2, which had a lot of variants in, was the best issue we did. 1 was really good. And then, Clem had it for volume 2. And then Bob was sort of an intermediary. Bob knew there were a lot of good 575 haiku, and that you probably should strive for 575, but not be limited by 575. Just strive to achieve it and get as close as you can. Although Bob himself wrote a lot of variants.
James Hackett was very, very prominent in the first few issues. And in the second or third issue, there was the announcement of haiku poetry written by James Hackett will be produced by American Haiku Press. And it was in the next issue. And there was never any James Hackett book being published. And the story is that instead James Hackett went to Blythe, and Blythe got him a Japanese publisher. And so then it was published in Japan and sent over here, and it made for, Clement was the one.
Clem was very indignant about that. Jim said, okay, let it go, and he released some copyrights so that they could do it, Jim and Don did. And it just, the battle actually was not between Hackett and American Haiku, Blythe and Clem Hoyt. The battle was really between Blythe's Zen master, Suzuki, and Clem had a Zen master in Japan, Senzaki. And the battle was really on their various thoughts of Zen. And
I was looking at the paper stock here. It's the same. This paper stock is left over from the Western poet. It was published.
okay.
And the cut. And we really talked a lot about the cut of this, so that it is kind of pocket sized and small poems, and it really works to put 4 on a page. So you're kind of reading both across and down.
The articles in there are very, very good, and they do talk about some very important things. And even in the second issue, there was the discussion of what is Senru, and that was Clement Hoyt doing it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it was a good article.
Yeah.
I think those articles would really be ripe for collecting and putting out as a book. I remember I was doing a paper on verbs in haiku, and I found that there were 4 or 5 articles in American Haiku by Bob Speece and Paul Tedworth, whatever his name was. Yeah,
Ted Larry,
different people about verbless haiku, about haiku with strong verbs, haiku with weak verbs, and everything like that. That really covered the waterfront and were just absolutely fundamental. I'll have the last question.
Yes.
Okay, why'd you quit?
Because Jim got bored. Jim, once something became successful, it was time to give it to somebody else. He just got bored with it. And Bob was more than happy to take it on. Also, there seemed at that time to him to be factions forming because there was a lot of argument about the 575 and the political wars about haiku he didn't want to get involved with.
There is a
Sounds
good...
like me.
Yeah. Yeah. And there is a good discussion of American haiku in the HSA, a haiku path, and it really does talk about some of the issues that they confronted, and it also gives a very nice response to how important American haiku was for the whole haiku scene, then and now.